Kit, thank you very much. My name is Ronald Blinas from HDR. We've been privileged to be working with Kit, DOT folks. Mike Pillsbury is with us, and I think Mark Sanborn in the back, and a few other folks. And so what we're here to present to you is where we are in the state rail plan. Really, we're at the recommended end of it, that we've done our findings, and we're there to kind of present the overall investigation and what we have found and what we're preparing to move forward as far as recommendations. So with that, one of the things I want to talk about is we're going to talk about both freight and passenger, and we're going to talk about them freight first and then passenger, because it's very important to view both sides of rail. And when we begin to look at rail, particularly in New Hampshire, we have to look at it from a regional perspective. We just can't simply look at it as what's in the state. And hopefully as we go through our presentation, it'll become more clearer. But this graphic here represents what the connecting railroads around New Hampshire and into the region. And a couple of things here that's very interesting to note is over in the left-hand corner there where Albany is in New York. That's where the majority of railroads going east all have to cross the Hudson. There's no further crossing of the Hudson all the way down through. So everything that moves east and west direction crosses at that point. So you see it's very important for New Hampshire's railroads coming across. If you look at the graphic there in New Hampshire, we colored the main lines red. And what those are is, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but those are we'll call it the primary routes. And then off that is our branch line. As we began to look at that and talk about it, it made sense for us to look at it in that aspect, and our presentations kind of focus in that direction. Our branch lines off the main lines really reach into the state, and this is what we depicted here. The green ones are what we're calling the primary branch lines. That's the branch line that comes up through Nashua here, up to Concord. The other one is over into Ossipee, goes up from Rochester up in Ossipee. Sand and gravel is primary movement there. And then the little smaller one over in the Portsmouth area going down to Portsmouth is our third. And those are what we're calling the primary branch lines. And then in yellow is the extension of some of those branch lines. And really those are less active but still important as in part of the rail network. One of the things is there's been a vision for passenger rail in a number of different venues, and it's been talked about a lot, obviously, in the Nashua area. And this graphic represents that the regional vision for rail, including passenger rail, has been there. And in recent years, this graphic here is the New England states getting together and looking what the vision for the whole region is. Again, looking at passenger as well as the freight side of connections. I won't go into the details of this, but there is a vision, and what we're talking about here fits in with that vision in total. It's helpful to kind of understand how the railroads work, and particularly when we're looking at the freight side. And so this graphic kind of helps us understand that. And what I'd like to point out is that the greenish hue there represents 76% of tonnage moved in New Hampshire. And more specifically, if you can read the text on there, it is what's called through traffic. And if you go back to the graphic, I talked about the main lines, where much of that routes are connecting. They go through the state, and they connect to our south, and they connect to our north and west and east. And what we see is a lot of the traffic that you'll see moving on rail lines in New Hampshire are passing through and making connections. And that's how we get product into our branch lines and move through. So the connectivity of that. So while there's a great number of through traffic, it is important as part of the vital nature of rail within the state. The other bluish colors represent some of the then subdivide of the product that's moved within the state. And some of the key pieces up there are coal and petroleum products. Many of us have seen the coal train go by our door out here. We have stone and gravel. I referenced the Ossipee as a primary example. We have lumber and forest products. All types of materials that you would, bulk type of materials that you'd associate with rail and what we'd expect to see here. When we look at what's happening, we have to put some of the trends together. And this is a graphic. We try to link a couple of different sources of data together. The dotted line at the top is U.S. railroads and their trends from the late 90s up through 2010. The bars, vertical bars, represent the traffic in New Hampshire, and they're not on the same scale, but they are plotted so they give an idea of the trends, one versus the other. And one of the things to note is that in the recent years, our trends in New Hampshire have been down. But I would like to think, and I can just point out that we don't have the 2010 data for New Hampshire. That comes from Association of American Railroads. We got the national data just recently that's represented in our upturn on that dotted line, and we hope to see the same thing in New Hampshire. Just anecdotally, we're seeing a recovery in the freight. But we still have that downturn, and we need to deal with that, and we need to understand it. So one of the things we did is start looking at that and look at some of the pieces that make that up. And when we look at that data, a couple of things are interesting. And while I could talk a number of minutes on this slide, I want to point out a couple of things here and move on. First, I'd like to note that the population in Maine and New Hampshire is exactly the same. And I've asked everybody to put that together. I said, you sure that's right? Yes, that's the census data. So it's actually a very interesting observation. But when we look to the very right, compare Maine and New Hampshire on what's called carloads per mile. And in the railroad business, we look at how much is moving on a particular mile of track. And what we want to see is at least a minimum of 100 cars a mile is really the kind of the break-even point where our railroad is considered reasonably vital and thriving. Now, we have 126 cars average per mile. That may be skewed because we're lumping everything. And if you go back to that through data information I showed, it's just lumping everything. But it does give us a good matrix and a good look at compared to Maine, where there's a lot of mileage across the state. They're down to 49. And if we look through Massachusetts, they're a little higher at 302. Vermont is somewhat comparison to 177. Connecticut, very little freight moves down there, and their average carload per mile is 42. Rhode Island is not too far away from us at 116. So it does give us an idea that, yes, New Hampshire's railroads are doing reasonably well. There's enough volume to encourage continued freight expectation moving. One of the questions, going back to that graphic with the bars on it, what is making that New Hampshire trend on the freight side happen? So as we looked at it, that was the questions we asked ourselves. We began to look at, okay, what's some of the breakdowns? Let's look at some of those pieces within that pie that I talked about. And on the left-hand side, there's two columns there, two graphs that represent things that are not too drastic, somewhat stable. If you can see the upper left-hand corner is coal and petroleum products. That's remained relatively stable, as you can see, and as we'd expect. Our total through traffic, represented by the lower left, has had that downturn that we talked about, and that started uptick. We haven't seen the data for 2010, but we expect that to uptick like the national. So really, through traffic and our major coal and petroleum products have really kind of stayed okay. The two graphs on the left, on the right, really represent some of our major downturns. It really represents where we've lost some of the business in New Hampshire, and it's not unexpected. Our interviews, we went out and did a lot of interviews with stakeholders, shippers, a number of people that are in the industry. And the things that we are seeing here in these two graphics really are kind of representative of what we've heard. And what they are is aggregate, the first one up on the top. You see a very strong peak in the 2001, 2000 range. And if you're familiar with the Big Dig in Boston, that was consuming a great deal of concrete. And where the sand was coming from, majority of that was out of our New Hampshire Ossipee pit. And there was carloads, train loads going daily to Boston on a very substantive base. And that's changed. I mean, that project's down. That's done, fortunately. And so we've seen a downturn, and that's simply because of that particular major element, which someone inflated in the early 2000 time period. And there's been a general downturn. So our aggregates had a very substantive change in a downturn from when the peak was that we were looking at. Similarly, when we look at pulp and paper, I don't think we have to talk about too many cases that our paper industry has certainly taken a very substantive downturn. The same thing has happened across New England. Maine certainly has experienced the same sort of thing. Our paper mills have really, we've lost a lot of those. And as we look at the volume that's handled on the rail side, which a paper mill really is supported very strongly by rail, we've seen a great downturn. So those are really, if we drill down to those numbers, I show that it's really kind of the core. Some of those businesses that depend on the bulk movement of goods really have had a downturn. And some of the difficulty is that with the paper industry, we don't see a real resurgence in the near future. There's been some uptick, as you've seen, but some of these things are going to be difficult to turn the corner on. So that's some of the products. I'm going to look at some of the data and the movement of rail. Let's look at how some of the freight things actually work. How are they managed? And I think it's important to note a couple of things. New Hampshire Department of Transportation maintains and owns a lot of the rail corridor in New Hampshire. And many people would be surprised to hear that. But a lot of it has been corridors that have been abandoned over time. The railroads, the states pick them up. Many of them become short lines across the state, and that's a very positive thing. A lot of that corridors are rail banked and are potentially available for future use. And so a lot of that, that's why the state owns a lot of that trackage. A couple of the pending ones, we were over in Portsmouth the other night. The Hampton branch, as some of you are familiar with, right in the Portsmouth area, is one that potentially might be up for purchase by the state in the not too distant future. When we look at freight railroads, it's important to note that the private companies, generally speaking, if anybody keeps track of Warren Buffett, you note that he bought a railroad out to the northwest. Actually bought a railroad, the Burlington Northern. So they are private companies, and they are in business to make money, and more importantly, they use the money that they make to reinvest in their infrastructure. So it is important to note that there is a recognition that they are a company that we are dealing with. Not that they are part of the transportation network, but they are not simply ours to do from a public point of view what we wish. We have to partner with them when we look at opportunities and going forward. So that's an important thing to know. We want to talk about a little about the passenger side of things. What's the existing conditions? And sometimes people, certainly over here, we talk about needing to get passenger here. Well, the interesting thing is we fail to realize sometimes we already do have passenger service in the state. And it's important to note, and the reason for that is it does serve a lot of people in New Hampshire. Beginning on the left-hand slide, that represents the Vermonter that goes to the west part of the state, goes from Washington all the way up into Massachusetts, comes into the western part of the state, actually has trackage for 12 miles. Peter, you're shaking your head. And has actually a station, Claremont, in New Hampshire. And the stations at White River Junction, along the route, Brattleboro, all serve New Hampshire residents as well. On the other part of the state, many of us are familiar with the Downeaster, and it's been a very successful line. And actually, the most recent figures, the 203,000 passengers ride from New Hampshire stations. And that's just about half of an annual ridership. It's probably 40% of the Amtrak service for the Downeaster. So two things. First of all, that service provides a very substantive part of the Amtrak revenue to that service, but more importantly, it is an existing service and it's used. And 200,000 people demonstrate that there's a value there. They take it by choice because they have to pay for it. So I think it's sometimes we forget that we have an existing service. And when we did the Vermont rail plan, same thing. It became important to realize that what's there today is not an absolute given. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that we need to consider in that context. I showed you a graphic of the vision. And this is kind of the same thing, but with a number of the projects more focused in the New Hampshire area. And I won't spend a lot of time going through, but it's the graphics over here, and if there's anything we want to talk about, feel free, we'll talk about it afterwards. But a couple of highlights here, that there's a number of studies going on, number of projects going on. I'll point out, I mentioned the Downeaster, the blue over the very right, and you can see a dashed blue line extending up over there. That's the extension to Brunswick. going through Freeport. So those of you that want to go to Freeport, I think it's this year, this fall, they're looking to hopefully open that up. Big extension for them. And included in that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our recommendations, they are going through a service development plan, looking what is the future of the Downeaster. So that's something that is being looked at and very important. Again, our existing service and what's going to happen to it. A couple other studies looking down in Massachusetts. There's a study from Boston to Springfield going down to New Haven called the Inland Route, with a leg going from Springfield up the same Vermont corridor that's used today into the upper part of Vermont, and with a vision of connecting to Montreal. That study will be probably going in the next couple of months. Similarly, in Maine, there's a consideration of looking up over the top of New Hampshire. Could there be a route serving Montreal going up through Maine, western part of Maine, top part of New Hampshire, and then into Montreal that way? That's a study that's been nearly complete. There's a number of studies out to the western part of New York, all connecting to the system. And then in our own state here, there's a couple of studies that will be going close to home here. The New Hampshire Capital Corridor study, we expect to be ongoing in the next couple of weeks, or at least authorization to proceed. And then extension of passenger service potentially to Plastow from Haverhill is a study that hopefully is going to be going again in the next several months. So there's a lot going on as far as passenger. And again, it's important to kind of remember that New Hampshire by itself is part of a larger system, and this is what we're trying to demonstrate here. Let's talk a little bit about what's the trends in that service. It's helpful to note across the nation we see a substantive uptick over the course of time for all Amtrak service. That's the top graph. If we then look at the Vermonter, again on the left-hand bottom, we see their ridership is growing recently as well. Very positive. We see the Downeaster has had some substantive growth and has remained stable. And there's a whole bunch of potential reasons for that, particularly parking limitations. Portland and even our own Exeter is a good example of some of the limitations, and their own equipment. The reason why they're doing their planning and looking into the future. Management of the passenger rail system. And I talked about how the freight system is structured, how railroads on the freight side are a private entity, as well as the state owning some rail lines. From the passenger side, we still have the same thing. Many of those rail lines the state owns are operated by either leased freight operators or some of our tourist railroads that we'll talk about in a minute. The New Hampshire Rail Transit Authority, some of us have served on it and still do today. That is an organization that many of us have seen or heard about recently, supporting and trying to help promote passenger rail in this particular area and across the state as well. They have authority and input, not just for the New Hampshire Capital Corridor, but on a state basis as well. The Amtrak service, the Downeaster, the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority, is the entity, the authority that manages that, primarily connected to the state of Maine, DOT. That's where a lot of their funding and connections come from. But they really are a separate entity with a management group that operates that service. The Vermont Agency of Transportation manages the Vermont service. And then we have the Amtrak, which is a national service, which does operate those services we talked about, the Vermont and the Amtrak. Then the other entity, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, many of us are familiar with, and really one of the things that we're looking potentially for the Capital Corridor, maybe an extension of that service. I mentioned the possibility of extension from Haverhill to Plastow. That is extending MBTA service up into New Hampshire. So it's important to note that's one of our obviously very substantive efforts. And many of our people now, if you go look at the stations on the borders, they travel down to the existing stations and take that in. So we do make strong connections and use that already. Rail system benefits. And people say, well, what are some of the benefits of rail? Good question. And certainly one that our team asked and tried to look at and define. And so when we try to put this in some sort of understandable package for ourselves as well as for folks like yourself, we try to look at some metrics that helps us understand and present this. And a couple here that I think are helpful. Approximately 4.7 million tons in the state annually are transported by rail. excuse me, transported transported by rail, and that represents 7.3% of all tonnage moved in the state. So you see that while that's a relatively small compared to trucks, it still is a fairly large number. And the thing I want to point out here is that the important thing is that that is by choice. There are shippers that use that because there's a value to them, or else they wouldn't be using it. So it's important to note that while that number may be small, there is a reason and there is a benefit to our New Hampshire folks that are using freight rail today. And so if we say, well, no, that's not a lot, what would happen if we didn't have the rail system on the freight side? Let's look at that. 75-car train, freight car train, has a capacity of 280 trucks. So if we took all that 7% of tonnage that's moved by rail, that represents about 200,000 trucks annually coming onto our roads. So that unto itself is an issue. Then if we look at it from a point of view of some environmental issues, we see that freight trains are 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks. And again, part of the reason potentially freight railroad rates can be cheaper. And actually, as we look at the price of fuel continuing to go up, freight railroads tend to do better competitively. So as we look at simply comparing some of that savings or the difference of having that same tonnage moved by rail versus truck, we see that if we had that moving by truck, we would have nearly 18 million gallons of fuel more consumed, or some impact to our state of about $70 million that would be spent on simply fuel. A ton mile of freight moved by rail versus truck reduces greenhouse emissions by at least 2/3. So many of the things that when we're looking at trying to identify benefits, particularly if we're looking for federal funding, many of these types of things on the environmental side, what's the benefits to us from a total environmental point, that's important to know. New Hampshire railroads, let's look at the employment side. New Hampshire railroads employ 200 people directly. That's in running the trains, taking care of the tracks, maintaining their equipment. Then let's look at how that relates to our economy. According to the U.S. Bureau of Statistics, freight-dependent New Hampshire industries directly employ more than 245,000 people. That's linked across the state. If we use our 7% figure above, we estimate then that 17,000 jobs are linked to the rail side and dependent on the rail side. So it starts to put into perspective that there is, again, an importance of the rail side to our New Hampshire economy. And when we look at economics, we always talk about how the impact of those jobs that are linked to something have a multiplier effect. In this case, the bottom bullet talks about those 17,000 direct jobs that are supported as a result of New Hampshire industries, reaches across a number of places. The example here is a propane retailer that we have in the state employing approximately 80 people. They induce about 86 indirect jobs across the country. And those multiplier effects, we see that there's about $18 million worth of labor, income, and business and property tax revenue generated as a result of that direct service here in New Hampshire. So if we simply just take that one example and multiply it, again, recognizing that there is a choice to use rail by the people who do use it. There is a reason for New Hampshire people to use it, and it's important to understand it. Let's look at some of the passenger rail options. Passenger rail provides mobility options, somewhat intuitive, going back to what I discussed about the existing use of the Downeaster. People choose to use it, and it's primarily because for them it's a better way to travel than an automobile. That's what we're always comparing to. Train travel can reduce in some of these corridors, particularly in our commuting times, travel time compared to highway. When we started to try to look at how do you define that, the Texas Transportation Institute across the nation looks at travel times within regions. So we looked at that information and drilled down into it. If we're looking at New Hampshire to 128, and that any of those major corridors, travel time can be expected to take 40% longer during peak commuting hours from when you normally drive it. Then we look at 128 going into the hub of Boston. You can expect that those commuting times can be 100% longer during peak periods. And let me put that in there so it'll work. really, I'd just like to echo that. That's exactly what we're trying to do here is remember, this is a statewide rail plan. This sets the basis. We've talked a lot about freight and how things work across the state. So it really is hopefully setting the groundwork for a number of studies that are going on that may have very significant local interest as well. So I appreciate those comments, and they really are really fit in with what we're trying to do here with this. Just finishing up in this thought about the mobility side of things. Commuting by public transit results in reduced emissions. And when we look at that side again on the passenger side, we looked at it on the freight side, there's significant reductions in carbon dioxide. Here, an Exeter to Boston commuter driving daily produces about 23,000 pounds of carbon dioxide annually. A train traveler making that same trip is about 10% of that. So again, we can take credit for this when we're looking at trying to what's the public benefits for making some investments, particularly on the passenger side. When we look at what's some of the economic benefits, what are some of the specifics, and when we look at trying to understand how we can make a case for the passenger rail opportunities. Economic benefits are affirmed by the utilization of Down East. I talked about that. There are people that use it. There is a reason. So they make a choice because there's a benefit to them, whether it's a cheaper way to travel, whether it's an easier way to travel, or some combination thereof. Passenger rail in New Hampshire can support increased values near stations and support downtown revitalization. Certainly it's an element we've seen multiplied a lot of places, and it's something that can be used. The Downeaster makes a big point of that. The Brunswick station that's built waiting for the train now is an example that even Amtrak across the country is promoting. Household transportation options and mobility are enhanced by passenger rail through improved access to jobs. Many times, rail can provide an opportunity for somebody that may not be able to get there themselves. It actually provides that second option for a car or something like that. So rail can provide an option that you wouldn't have otherwise. And one of the things that a lot of people choose to take public transportation, passenger rail in particular, is because it reduces that second car. And when we look at reducing that second car, we don't have that. We can reduce household costs by nearly $8,500 annually. And having had a teenage son that had to support that second car, and now I don't have it, I would argue that that is a real figure. And more importantly, it's $8,500 of cash. You know, when you think about how much you have to make that $8,500, it really is money that comes into a family and economy. So there's a real benefit when we look at it from that point of view. Rail can support future transportation needs. And I think it's important for us to note, and I want to just take a moment to put in context, this rail plan is not just for today. It is looking at how do we look for the transportation in the future? Where do we go? And I've been very encouraged as I've worked in the rail industry and working with highway departments and really looking at transportation as a whole. There's been a very strong shift to recognizing that we need to look at transportation modes as how they link together. What is our total transportation needs and how do they work together? The rail has made great strides in recognizing they're part of the transportation, and there's been far more collaboration among the states and railroads and truckers and a combination of that than there has been ever before. And that's really where we're headed. And that's the basis of this plan, is how does rail fit into the whole state's needs when we look at transportation. So if we look at a couple of things here that's important to note is that when we're looking ahead, we don't expect that the highway system is going to be expanded more. We would expect to see the Route 93 widening completed, but you know, we don't expect, I wouldn't expect that we would see too many more highway expansions being viable in at least the foreseeable future. So what is, I'll show you a graphic in a minute, that freight is expected to continue to grow. How do we take care of that? How do we take care of increased use of vehicles on the roadways? Rail can provide that opportunity, and that can be in the form of our passenger service. It can also be in the form of increased freight movement. So there is that side of the whole transportation system that's important to know. So a couple of things that is beneficial for New Hampshire. When we look at our transportation, our infrastructure of rail in New Hampshire, one of the things is that, generally speaking, we have a potentially willing partner to work with us to expand service, including passengers on their rail systems. There's excess capacity now. Many of our right-of-ways have been double-track right-of-ways. Now they're single. could easily be expanded to double track. And there, even within single track area, there is underutilization of assets. So we want to consider that as an opportunity and an asset from a transportation point of view. Some of the things that would be helpful for us to realize is some of the those same rail right-of-ways, because they exist from a right-of-way point of view, those improvements to add capacity might be $1 to $3 million a mile compared to 15 or more on a highway project, simply because there is existing base infrastructure, and so it's important for us to know. But one of the things that we want to point out, and I'll just kind of go back to some of the comments I had earlier, is freight railroads maintain their infrastructure based upon the revenue they get from their operations. So what you say to yourself, well, how come the infrastructure, maybe some of our railroads, are not what it wants to be? We're not pleased with that. Well, part of it is because, as we've seen, as we see that downturn in business, they have to balance their investments on what they have coming in the door. And sometimes, railroad is a very intensive infrastructure because they maintain their own infrastructure versus highways that are provided and trucks to use them with paying taxes or tolls. So one of the things is we need to balance that when we're considering that. Rail investment, really when we're looking in the Hampshire system, is how does it fit and where's our best opportunities going forward. Some of our issues, a little further expansion, and this is the graph I made mention of. When we look at the total transportation system, this is a Federal Highway map of future growth in freight, and this was recently revised. We were using a 2030 projection a couple of years ago. And this one's even more dramatic in the sense that looking out to 2040, the red simply means where is congested highways within our system by 2040. And realizing that there's about a 50% increase projected for freight between the freight and the demand of highway, it is going to be difficult to move. So that's why, going back to what I said earlier, we need to look at our rail system as a potential means to deal with this congestion. And it's important to know. So as we look at some of the commodities, though, what are some of our opportunities, and where can we look for that? As we look at the commodities we listed here, some of the things that may drive some of those commodities back to rail, it's highlighted here. I mentioned fuel fluctuations. As fuel prices go up, railroads tend to do better. They are more efficient from a fuel point of view, and therefore they become more competitive. So it's something we want to understand and we want to keep and encourage to have as an opportunity. One of the things that's interesting is, believe it or not, truck driver shortages is very, very difficult for trucking companies now, and that's projected to continue. Even with our high unemployment, many trucking companies experience 100% turnover annually. And you try to think through, just think what it would be if you were in that business. So this becomes a real issue, and again, the railroads, from a point of view of moving tons per employee, if you will, is very competitive. So there's another opportunity for us to look for. And some of the things that also is very much on the horizon when we have changes, the Panama Canal. Many of us are speculating how that'll help or change where we see things. Our changes in our policies for energy imports and exports. Rail right now is very much in moving petroleum products around the country. Ethanol is being one of the most recent expansions in that. Essentially, many people have dubbed the railroads as a moving pipeline. And it is our increase in highway congestion. Certainly, we want to make sure that we're keeping our options for rail open. And kind of let's bring that back and talk about some of the particulars looking at our opportunities here in Hampshire. This slide goes back to, remember the discussion we talked about our main lines. And these are the lines that connect to the region, connect to the national network, and provide our opportunities and our connection to the branch lines that really serve much of the origin and destination points. Some of the things that are impacting the ability of railroads now to serve and respond to some of that growing demand of freight is some of the restrictions and some of the changes in the industry that's there. One of the most significant ones we see all across the country, New Hampshire is no different, is what's called the difference in 286 weight of car versus 263. And really what that is the national interchange standard for years and years has been that all cars if they're 263,000 pounds, can be moved anywhere on the common carrier system. Many of the larger railroads, the Class 1 railroads, have moved to increase that weight because it becomes more efficient. The de facto standard with the industry now is 286,000 pounds car weight. And what's happened, because that has moved without an official, this is where you're going to be by certain date, it's become, I'll call it, again, a de facto. Many of our short line railroads and our regional railroads are struggling to be able to handle that. And so if you can't handle that larger car, your shipper is disadvantaged. They either have to have it light loaded when it's moved, they have to have it transloaded either partly or fully along the way, and we become disadvantaged. So the importance of that is that we do have weight restrictions, serving many of the rail lines within New Hampshire. A couple of ones highlighted here, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic, across the upper corner of New Hampshire is one of them. New Hampshire has worked with St. Lawrence and Atlantic to seek some federal funds to improve conditions, rail conditions primarily, that would alleviate that restriction. The Pan Am main line, that's our main line that runs from Massachusetts and goes up through the Dover area where the Downeaster runs. That's the Pan Am main line. That has restrictions on it from air going up through to Dover area and then continuing into Maine. Some of those restrictions are on the Massachusetts side, so one of our recommendations is to work with Massachusetts to collectively figure out ways how that can be taken care of. And in New Hampshire, some of the restrictions are on the track coming up through this area here as well, the track owned by Pan Am Railways. Now, the bullet at the bottom I want to highlight is a situation where sometimes the investment in the passenger side has a benefit on the freight side. And it's important to note that, particularly when we're trying to seek the justification for potential investments on the passenger side. The note there says that as part of the Downeaster improvements from Maine, Portland in particular, all the way down into Massachusetts, they made improvements to bridge and rail conditions to support the increased movement of passengers. A secondary benefit or a side benefit of that is that as part of that, that rail line is now able to handle 286 restrictions, car weights. The difficulty is that there's some policy issues on the MBTA side and some constraints on the Massachusetts side that need to be taken care of so that that operation of 286 can be achieved. So that's one of our things that we'll talk about and we're looking toward. But I think the point of this is that there's a passenger investment that are very direct and important freight side, and that needs to be considered when we're looking at linking those two. Many of us have heard what's called the double stack or container moves. How many have ever seen a container train? That's where the containers are stacked? Good, good. Okay. It's really the fastest growing service for railroads across the country. And what's interesting is that, again, if you look at it, that is the linkage of rail and truck at its finest. Because as many of us know, we take those containers off trains that have hauled a long distance, we put them on a truck to deliver that last couple of miles, and it could be 200 miles or even 5 miles. So there's a linkage of our transportation system. That's why it's vital to now look at these together instead of individual modes competing with each other. So let's talk about the importance of it for New Hampshire in particular. And the graphic here represents the types of heights that's needed to move the double stack containers. The one on the very right, I'll just talk about that and highlight that. That is what's called full double stack, and that means that's 2 containers of the most high height that the ships will handle across the ocean. That's called full double stack. When you put those 2 together, you need 20 foot 8 inches of clearance. And many of our rail lines have less than that. The 19.6 will support what's called the smaller double stack. You'd have 2 smaller containers stacked together, and that would support the cars on the left-hand side, which are used to handle automotive movements, new cars moving. Those are, if you can see the ramps, that's where we load cars in. So both of these commodities are one of the strongest and biggest freight opportunities for our railroads in the area. And this particular graphic We'll begin to show some of the freight, and I'll have Dick come up here in a minute. Dick Flynn that works with us and speak to this and give you some examples. But I want to stop right here and highlight on that intermodal slide. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but when we did the Massachusetts rail plan, one of the importance of that was the corridor of Pan Am. We highlighted as a priority to increase for full double stacks. So it would come at least to air, and hopefully moving up into opportunities in the Maine and into New Hampshire. Just last week, I think it was, yes, last week, Thursday, I think it was, FRA granted to Massachusetts $2 million to engineer those clearances for full double stacked air. Very important, very substantive example of they're looking at something that they need and will have potential impact. So what's interesting is we're now moving toward this. We've talked about it with different people, and it gives us an opportunity for New Hampshire and into Maine that we hadn't had previously. So Dick, I'd like to have you come up, and what we want to do is just talk about a couple of examples of now how do things move and give you a perspective of some of the freight shipments that are moved. No. Well, I would disagree with you. We've talked a lot about passenger rail, and so. Well, I would. You hold your questions, and we'll get to that. But I would say that if you haven't listened to what I've said, you haven't heard that we're talking about a freight railroad and a passenger railroad, and in this state, they are synonymous running together. And it's important for us to understand the freight side, or else we won't have a passenger service. So I appreciate why you're here, and I appreciate why most people are here. And we will talk about passenger in just 1 minute. But I'd like to. Okay, Dick.
Thank you. I promise we'll tie those both together. As Ron mentioned, my name is Dick Flynn. I focused on the freight side, but in pointing that out and to the question, I think it's really important that if we go through the statistics that you heard and we try and bring that home and have that mean something to you, because one of the opportunities in New Hampshire, I think, to build a freight network, or excuse me, a passenger network, is to understand that the backbone of it is the freight that's moving today. There's two key numbers that Ron pointed out. One is there's 58,000 cars of freight moving across these branch lines that Ron spoke about. And there's 17,000 jobs attached to those within the state. So we really want to point out just 3 quick examples so you can understand what kind of businesses are moving freight today and where they're moving. I know you look at these maps and it's difficult to relate them to something very specific. So that's my intent, is to show you that. 3 maps, and you probably can't read the locations there, but the first example on the left deals with propane. And there's about 1,000 cars of propane that come into New Hampshire via rail. Most of that is used for heating, but what's important is if you look, and if you can see over on the left-hand side of that left-hand panel, that Selkirk, New York, which Ron mentioned, happens to be one of the major node points on the national rail network. It also happens to be the terminus of a pipeline that comes up from Texas that carries the propane. It doesn't go any further than New York. So from Selkirk, New York, across the yellow, you then see the 2 branch lines, the blue, which goes up to the North Lebanon area. And then if you look to the right, you see the black line, and then it goes up into the Rochester area just south of Ospey. Those are 2 major distribution points for propane, with over 1,000 carloads moving today via rail. So with the price of fuel oil, having the option for propane, the 1,000 carloads coming in by rail, that's a good backbone of business that puts traffic on those branch lines and helps support the investment in the infrastructure with private private money. The second one starts up at the very top up in Quebec, and that's cement. The red line shows it coming down through Montreal to just outside of Albany, New York. And then it goes across Massachusetts, up right through Nashua, and up to a distribution facility, Cement Quebec, which is in Bow. That handles about 500 cars a year. As Ron mentioned, the issue of weight capacity, they're only running at 29% capacity. They make up for that with trucks. If they had 286, they could fill out their rail cars. Their cars are running at less than full capacity right now. That would take trucks off the highway and also would bring a very important raw material for construction into that same distribution plant that's under capacity. The third is probably the one that you're more familiar with, and that's the coal. And we show there on the right-hand panel the coal that moves from the Appalachian region, mainly Pennsylvania, across Pennsylvania and New York State, into Massachusetts, and up to the Merrimack Station up in Bow, New Hampshire. What's important about that one is that one moves right through this town here, provides a solid basis of freight traffic, which helps underwrite the cost of anything that we've done with that right away going forward.
Thank you, Dick. And what we want to do is transition into some discussion on how the branch line issues fit in together, and then we'll move on to more specific discussions with passenger rail. One of the things that we looked at is Dick talked about the weight limits, but we looked at some of the other opportunities for branch line issues, and it's important for people in this neighborhood, this setting to, particularly I see some planners and others, we're looking at how do we look at support rail. One of the things that's been difficult for many of the rail industries and customers is the land use around rail has been moved away from industrial type of things to residential or even, we'll call it retail. That's been a very difficult thing. A lot of our distribution centers have moved away, and even our manufacturing. So one of our recommendations is to deal with how do we keep the focus on making sure our land use, available land, is kept as an option. That's a primary opportunity. And recognizing that our revenue must be supportive to keep our infrastructure going, how do we make sure that we deal with that? And really one of the things that has proved to be interesting is many times people move into the area, or even existing businesses, they have a lack of understanding of the freight. What's the opportunities? How do you actually ship by that? And some of those things that we'll deal with in our recommendations. So, Kit, do you want to begin to kind of talk about our recommendations on the freight side, and then you can continue in the passenger?
Thank you, Ron. Now that Dick showed me how to use this mic, I'll try to make myself heard. We have some draft recommendations for you to look at and hear about. And again, I want to emphasize that we're looking for your comments and anxiously awaiting your feedback on these. So we're going to first talk about some of the freight recommendations and then go through some passenger issues and recommendations on the passenger side. First is to deal with the weight restrictions that Ron spoke about, to identify the key points where the key lines that need to be upgraded to support the heavier cars, specifically looking for grant funding that we've worked for in the past on the St. Lawrence and Atlantic line up in the North Country through Berlin, and also to work with Maine and Massachusetts on removing or lifting the weight restrictions on the Pan Am main line and the New Hampshire main line that comes up here through Nashua. Also looking to improve the clearances for double stack to support intermodal traffic. The state law requires a 22-foot 6 clearance on new bridges, but obviously there are some existing restrictions that need to be removed and lifted as we replace bridges and other restrictions. And to work closely with the other New England states to remove clearance restrictions around the region, because as Ron pointed out, a major restriction in Massachusetts in the Hoosick Tunnel affects the whole northern New England region as well as eastern Mass. And finally, to continue our work in the area of safety and security, New Hampshire has a rail safety program and an inspector. We're actively involved with upgrading and replacing grade crossings for improved safety and performance, track inspection, and working with other state and federal agencies on rail safety. Similar recommendations for the branch lines. These are the ones that originate or end in New Hampshire as opposed to passing through. The weight limits affect these lines as well, so we hope to remove those, working closely with Massachusetts on some of the state-owned lines there that also affect New Hampshire. In working on passenger improvements, it's very important to realize that passenger improvements can improve the viability of the freight line for a freight customer. And in being able to make the case for the economic development that'll come through enhanced industry as a result of a rail line that's in better shape, that'll help us make the case for a passenger improvement. So in other words, if we're able to upgrade this line up to Bow for passenger service, that will also help public service and the Bow power plant with the coal train. We look to improve facilities and help improve facilities for freight distribution, transload facilities that can transfer freight from train to truck and get it to shippers in an area and receivers of freight in a region. We need to continue to work on our branch lines, many of which are owned by the state. There are new bridge inspection requirements. There are also significant needs for track improvements and maintenance. And we'll continue to support grant funding in that area as well, where it's available. An industrial rail access program is a program that many states have that provides a partnership in federal, state, and generally state, railroad, and shipper funds to build sidings and other rail facilities to support a new industry using rail. It's something that our industries are at somewhat of a disadvantage because we don't have that available. And finally, to provide more information and help to shippers in basically learning how to work with the railroad, how to improve their access to the rail system. We propose to work more closely with the other New England states around the region to participate in some close regional coordination that has begun among the state DOTs and including New York State to improve our regional network and to go after funding cooperatively to make improvements for the freight system that will also help passenger. To preserve our state-owned lines that we've acquired, which may be inactive, but to make sure that they remain in a condition that can be used for rail in the future and not turned over to other uses that may preclude that. And to acquire rail lines that may become abandoned to preserve them for future rail use. One example is the Hampton branch over in Hampton and Portsmouth that's in the process of being abandoned and has potential. The department proposes to continue to work to find federal funds to support our rail system, to work with shippers and more closely to find out what their needs are and how we can put them in contact with railroads and identify their needs, to respond to crises similar to Tropical Storm Irene, and to work to advocate for federal policies through legislation or regulation that support improvements to our rail system. Want to do the passenger issue?
No, keep going. Here.
Okay. On the passenger side, we've recommended some priorities for passenger improvements. One is very basically to keep what we have. We have the Downeaster and the Vermonter providing good passenger service that are well used in the Seacoast area and in the Connecticut Valley, and we want to make sure that those continue. We also have tourist excursion services in the North Country that are very important in the local economy, providing jobs and supporting the tourist economy up there. Make sure they continue as well. They operate on lines that are owned by the state. Second priority is to look at corridors and implement services on corridors for expanded service. Number one being the New Hampshire Capital Corridor through Nashua and Manchester for passenger service there. As the mayor mentioned, there's a study that we hope will get underway very soon if the governor and council approve the contract to begin the planning work for the Capital Corridor to Manchester and even to Concord. Second of these corridors is the Plastow, on the corridor that the Downeaster uses to extend commuter rail from Haverhill, Mass. Across the border into Plastow. We also have a study that we expect to be getting underway in a few months to do the engineering and environmental work to lay the groundwork for that service as well, working with the MBTA. And finally, a secondary group of corridors for future expansion include the Boston to Montreal high-speed corridor. It was studied a number of years ago. There is a feasibility to do this. There's a potential market. Obviously, it's a big project and it's a little ways out, but we don't want to lose sight of that, and we want to keep that as a priority. There's also been discussion of an intercity service connecting Portland to Montreal so that the Downeaster and any other services people could get on a train to Montreal from Portland, passing through northern New Hampshire. And there have been a number of other corridors that have been recommended for passenger use in the past, and we will discuss those and consider those as part of this third group of priorities. The sharing, as has been mentioned already, the sharing of freight and passenger service on a corridor has benefits to both. And these corridors include the Downeaster, the freight main line for Pan Am, the Connecticut River line that carries the Vermonter, as well as the New Hampshire Capital Corridor through Nashua here. It's just some examples of some improvements in addition to the one that Ron mentioned that benefit both freight and passenger. There has been a grant to repair the Merrimack River Bridge in Haverhill that the Downeaster travels over, the MBTA travels over, and the freight service travels over. So as a result of the, at least in part as a result of the existence or the presence of the passenger trains, Massachusetts was able to get significant funding to make an improvement that will benefit all the railroads. And the same thing, or a similar kind of situation on the Downeaster and on the Vermonter, passenger improvements that are underway now and mostly complete on the Vermonter will benefit the freight railroads as well, make their trains able to travel faster, permit heavier cars, and make their operation more cost effective. Just to briefly mention the tourist trains, as I did before, they're an important part of the local economy in the Lincoln area and in the Lakes region and up in North Conway. They provide jobs. They provide an important boost to the tourist economy in those areas. And they help to maintain and keep our state-owned railroads in good condition. Development around the station areas is another benefit that we may not think of. That I think Nashua is a great example. With a station here in Nashua, you'll undoubtedly see some redevelopment in that area for mixed use, retail. It becomes a great place for people to live close to the train. And this has happened in a number of communities where passenger service has been developed. It's important to realize that the Amtrak services that we have a cost. The states of Maine and Vermont have been paying the operating cost that's not met out of the fare box revenue. In the case of Vermont, it's about $4 million. In the case of the Downeaster, it's about $8 million a year. These costs are most likely to increase as a result of some federal legislation that requires states to pay the full cost of their trains. This is an issue not only for those states, but for New Hampshire, because obviously we enjoy the benefit of those services, and it's important to look at them on a regional basis. So some of the forms that support could take include a direct support for operation, capital improvements to the corridors, either through track improvements to make operation more efficient, bridge improvements or repairs, or maybe some equipment for the trains, or station improvements in the station communities, because Maine is clearly not going to pay for station improvements in New Hampshire, and the same thing with Vermont. So to summarize the draft recommendations we have for passenger, we're proposing to help continue what we have. We need to do a better job of coordinating with the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority on the Downeaster. As Ron mentioned, they're doing a service development plan, kind of a strategic plan for their service. And we need to work with them to identify what comes out of that plan, what their goals are for the Downeaster in the future, and where we might fit in. An example could be for startup support for any expansion that they might have that would benefit New Hampshire. Investment in the infrastructure, capital investment, as I mentioned, track or stations or equipment. And there are even investments within the corridor, but that may not be in New Hampshire, that would benefit the service as a whole and the people who ride from New Hampshire. Could be track improvements even in Massachusetts, or improvements at North Station, for example. So in order to do some of these things, we'll support grants, or we need to support grant requests that maybe the other states make for passenger improvements or improvements to those corridors, and we have done that. We need to do more and do a better job at encouraging intermodal connections. One of the strong benefits of the Capital Corridor is its proximity to the Manchester Airport, and the fact that having passenger rail would be a huge selling point for the airport as it looks to grow in the future. And that's a major intermodal connection. Transit-oriented development is a term for the type of downtown development that can be encouraged and spurred by having a transit facility like a rail station. And finally, support the tourist services, as I mentioned. Finally, in the expansion area, the two studies that I mentioned, the Capital Corridor study for the Nashua-Manchester corridor, once the study is underway and complete, and we have the findings on what the preferred alternative is, we're recommending that be implemented. And the same thing with the Plastow. Once all the details are known, we're recommending that we move forward with that to implementation. So finally, as we've talked about, there are a number of major benefits that our rail system provides, both on the freight and passenger side, that people may not be aware of: economic benefits, environmental benefits, and more personal mobility benefits. So really taken together, the system provides an important resource to the people of New Hampshire, and we hope that the plan will make that clear, and as we move forward in the next few months to write the plan and publish it, that the benefits and these recommendations will be more widely known. So now it's your turn. Between us, we'll take your comments, and certainly if you have questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them.
Maybe you want to just pass that mic around so they ask that question.
About, I'm guessing 6 years ago or so, we had a symposium much like this in St. Anselm College up in Goffstown. And everybody was all gung-ho about this Capital Corridor service. And at the time, I brought up the fact, why don't we get the commuter service from Lowell, where it terminates now, up to Nashua and get that in place, which is easy to do. It's only 7 miles of track rehabilitation, and there'll be no stations involved at all, so it'll just be a matter of running the trains up there and getting the sidings and the layover facilities. And everybody was all gung-ho on this whole thing, and about a year ago, it just disappeared. Now you're proposing we do some more engineering studies for the same thing that we've already spent 6 years doing. What happened to all that information? It just disappeared? I mean, why do we have to do more engineering studies? We studied it to death. Now it's time to put it into some action, as far as I'm concerned. And let's start with getting the trains up to Nashua And then we'll worry about getting them up to Manchester and Concord, where there's a lot less demand than there is to Nashua. That's my opinion.
Thank you. I have a 7 o'clock meeting downstairs, so thank you for putting me up. A lot of great information tonight, and a little closer, a lot of great information tonight, and I checked off a lot of what I had to ask about, but the thing to remember, and the reason we keep starting over, is the elections, and this is what happens. It stops being a priority. Everybody needs to remember that by limiting our economic engine, which we have with freight not being able to cover everything, we can't bring a big industry here if we don't have a way to put their product onto a train, onto a boat, or onto an airplane. So that's key. If that's what we really care about, this is what we need to care about. And including train and including the boats, I think, is very key. The other thing I didn't see a lot of up there was hospitality is our #1 industry, and I'm looking to book a vacation for this summer. I'm filling out a thing that drills it down over the country. One of the requirements is, do you need a car or not? And it limits where you can go in the whole country by, can you get there by train, or do you have to have a car? So tying in our Hobo Railroad, our Winnipesaukee, all of that can make a huge difference. So I really want to see more of a focus on tying it to the airport and tying it to the seacoast, because those are the things that if we want to attract employers that hire manufacturing, this is what we need, and until we have it, we have limited our opportunity. Now, Nashua is already an economic engine for the region, so I think it is important that we do take that first step, but we need to work towards intermodal, and we need to do it now. Thank you.
The first objection anybody raises to expanding passenger rail is the cost to the taxpayer. I wonder if any statistics have been compiled on the comparative capital cost and operating cost per seat mile for cars versus trains, cost to the taxpayer.
Partially related to what this gentleman had just said, all you have to do is read the Manchester Union Leader, and anytime the subject of rail comes up, it's always about the subsidies. And you can have all of the engineering and planning studies you want and lay things out as you've done here, but unless you've done a sales job to overcome the preconceived notions that it's just a giant taxpayer sinkhole, it's not going to go anywhere. As he said, we're going to be in study after study. And people think, for example, that the gas tax pays for all the highways, and they don't understand where all the money for I-93 is coming. And so just as important as in laying out the business case to the businesses, this has to be sold to the taxpayers, and you can't let opponents just absolutely control the dialogue without some sort of a counter on the other side.
Just wondering what the current and the future working relationships will be between the passenger service and the industries that will be served. Historically, there's been a pushback by freight railroads against passenger rail, and I would assume this would be a similar case in New Hampshire. I'd love to see passenger rail come to Nashua. In fact, I'd like to see where the original location of the Union Station was to be a rail bus taxi building similar to Lowell. It's kind of a crossroads with Hollis Street. It would service people from Hudson, Litchfield, jump on a train or a bus, whatever. But my main question is, what is going to be the working relationship between the various interests, the freight railroads and the passenger service, mainly the MBTA?
I'll just respond to your question. That is always a concern in developing new passenger service on a freight railroad, and freight railroads in general are not enthusiastic about adding that. They see it as a potential liability and have other concerns. It will be addressed in the final plan. There'll be a full plan. I just would comment that it's been a successful relationship in Maine between NEPRA and the host railroad. They've been very cooperative, and the railroad agrees that they've received a benefit, and their customers have benefited from those improvements. So we expect it to be a positive relationship. The MBTA has certain access rights on the line. Obviously, there's a cost, and the cost has to be met, but we expect a constructive relationship. We have quite a few in the back here.
Thank you. Thank you. Since the year 2000, I've heard nothing about, and read it in the paper about passenger rail, and you've said we're going to do a study, we're going to do another study, and like the other gentleman said, where have all these studies gone to? To begin with, I'm going to be very candid. I know the people that own Pan Am, which used to be Guilford Rail. They have no intentions of having any passenger service. And when they run their railroad like they do, their freight service, and the accident that happened down at Canal Street a couple of years ago, that track, I used to be there. I'm a railroad buff, and I used to watch the tracks move and everything else, and you can see this in another place up where I call it Roby's Crossing, further up in New Hampshire. A rail would come all the way up till the next coal car came down and hit it to go down, and that was like that for I don't know how long. These people, and they've been told about it, I talked to one of the railroad men, he said, Mr. Mellon and Mr. Fink were told about this, and they didn't care because it's cost money to make repairs, but what do you want to try to do, kill somebody and everything else? And I think passenger rail should be here, because your rail, where you have passenger rail, the cars are full. There's no problem with that, but I think, and I think you people too that are given this thing here, all you want to do is work with freight. It was obvious when you always was freight till now. That's about all I have to say. I'll be dead before there's any passenger rail here. It's never going to happen, and you're just, giving us lip service on it. Everybody, practically everybody here is interested in passenger rail, and just to jump on a train and go into Boston. I'd love to do that. I've been waiting to do that, and it isn't going to happen. And that's what I have to say on the matter.
I'm Brian McCarthy. I'm the president of the Board of Aldermen. I wanted to first reiterate the support that the board has had for rail, both freight and passenger, to Nashua. Last term, we passed a resolution unanimously endorsing the concept. There were some turnovers in the board, and we haven't voted this year. But since 10 of the members of the board, including 2 of the 4 new members, are here this evening, I think we can conclude that the board is still fairly united in its support of rail. I think it's important to pursue continuing freight, because that is, as transportation costs rise, the best hope we have for any kind of renewed manufacturing economy, which, if you listen to national studies, we are having some success at reintroducing manufacturing to the United States, but given that we're not close to ports, the cost of long-distance transportation of goods to and from New Hampshire will be important in terms of increasing that ability to provide jobs through manufacturing. With regard to passenger rail, I think it is extremely important that we pursue the entire capital corridor and do things like connect the airport, which will enhance the airport's ability to attract traffic from northern Massachusetts. Right now, even from Nashua, it's often a lot easier to fly out of Logan than it is to fly locally. We need to reduce that benefit of the high traffic airport in order to, 1, make air traffic work better, and 2, make Manchester Airport successful for local economic development. In terms of passenger rail, my neighbor asked before about subsidies, and I'll give the same description I gave to both houses of the legislature when I talked about it. I work in Waltham at the moment, and every morning I get up, I get on a road that Nashua built, Nashua maintains, and Nashua plows. I drive into Massachusetts and I get on Route 3 and go south. I come back up on the same roads in the evening, and when I buy gas, I pay a gas tax to New Hampshire. I am subsidizing roads I don't use. So yeah, we do subsidize roads all over the place. The federal government subsidizes them. The interstate highway system was built at what is a current cost of about $500 billion, and that certainly subsidized both automobile traffic and the automobile industry at the time it was done. Commuting south, passenger rail won't do me a lot of direct good getting to Waltham, but if I can get a lot of my friends who turn left at the intersection of 128 off of the road, I can have an easier time turning right. And your figures about the commute doubling are about what I experience. It takes me 35 to 40 minutes to get down there off hours. It takes me anywhere from an hour to an hour and 45 minutes if I'm going down at rush hour. If I consider what that actually costs us, most of the people who are on the road between here and Boston are professionals who, when they're not driving, are working. And if I look at the half-hour extra I spend in each direction, I spend an hour looking at brake lights that I wouldn't otherwise do, as do about 20,000 other people. That's 20,000 hours a day of professional time, or about one 20-person startup, or one 10-person startup every day. And in terms of what that does in community advantage, having an extra startup every day competing with the rest of the world certainly can't hurt our local economy. So it is very important to me that we look at passenger rail not just as passenger rail throughout New Hampshire, but also commuter rail in terms of relieving the traffic to the south of us. We're not going to see much more capacity built. Even if there were the money to build things, there just isn't the footprint to put more road space between here and Boston. What we have is about what we're going to get. So rail is the only hope for vastly improving the amount of traffic that we can support on the transportation network. So I think all of those things are important, and I certainly hope your plan endorses all of those actions as we go forward.
My name is Ronnie Camille, and I wanted to ask the DOT, what is the current relation, and I know the gentleman in the back mentioned it, what is the current relationship with the private industry that owns the line between Lowell and up north, between Nashua and beyond? And how much capital asset would be needed to get that going for commuter rail between Lowell, Nashua, and beyond?
We don't have a formal relationship through any type of contract with the railroad at the moment. I mean, they're a private business. They're regulated by the federal government primarily. We've worked together in the past on different planning projects, the work that was done here before, the Lowell to Nashua work. So we would expect to work with them closely on the planning process going forward as well. The second part of your question, and to the first gentleman who spoke, you know, a number of years ago, we did preliminary engineering, quite a bit of the work that was needed to support applying for funds to build the extension from Lowell to Nashua for commuter rail and the environmental work. We didn't have the matching funds for any federal funds, so we couldn't go forward with the project. We had no way to provide the match. So what we're proposing to do now is look at the larger corridor as well. We don't have to go back and do everything over that we did before, but we need to do the planning work north of Nashua, basically. It hasn't been done to any level of detail to support a grant application. So in order to go for federal funds to build the project and any matching funds that we would need, this is a step that has to be taken to identify the costs of the alternative, what other alternatives there are and how it would be implemented and a number of other details.
Hey, Kit? You mentioned a little bit, but I'm not sure that you, but going back to the question about the relationship, you want to just emphasize the existing agreement that MBTA and Pan Am has for extension of the service up here?
Yes,
Expand on that.
I alluded earlier to, I'm sorry I've got my back to people, but I alluded earlier to the access. One of the issues with commuter rail is that the private railroad owns the tracks. They don't have to provide access to commuter rail. The state of Massachusetts, the MBTA, and Pan Am Railways had negotiated an agreement a year or so ago to provide that access all the way to Concord. So the MBTA has the rights now to operate passenger service on that line in New Hampshire. And that was a very important agreement. It was a tremendous step forward for development of this service. There's still plenty of work to be done, but that's one very important detail that was taken care of.
Having passenger service versus passenger service as well as freight. That makes sense. But we here in New Hampshire, most of the towns or in the cities, we're a city of Nashua, we don't have a base, a tax base in most of the towns here. The plant for the paper plant further up north is closed now. I think there's a couple of cement plants around, but other than that, we don't have a base. So when you talk about shipping things up this way, what are you going to ship up this way? There's really nothing to ship here, so that we plan for the yin and the yang. In other words, how many people here would take a train to Berlin or to past Concord, actually, when you think about it, and how would we be able to, I just feel like we're being put on the back burner for the passenger end of things because we don't have the yin with the yang, so to speak.
Well, just to kind of clarify, I don't think we're looking at passenger service in the North Country other than quite a ways out in the future. So that's where the corridor goes to Concord and the Plastow. And the point of showing those freight improvements and some of the track improvements and so forth that Ron talked about was to show the types of things that can be done to make the freight rail system work more efficiently. And if it's more efficient and cost effective, it can serve more shippers. There are companies out there that could use more rail in a different environment. The cement, Dick mentioned that the cement plant is running at under capacity. With a different rail system that meets the higher standards, it could run more cement cars. The brewery in Merrimack is a rail customer. That's a potential growth. So there are other businesses that could use freight rail. And it's not to say that it has to be, you have to have both at the same time to make either one work, but they do support each other and contribute to each other.
A lot of the towns have turned their rail beds into walking trails, et cetera. What happens there? Do we turn those back into rail beds again, or are they going to remain the walking trails?
Well, what we're looking at is for rail improvements is on the active lines where the track is in place. We're recommending that those be kept intact, those rail trails kept intact, so that if and when we need them for rail in the future, they're still available and they haven't had buildings built on them and so on.
Hey, Kit? There's a couple.
Let him go first.
Hi. I think we all now clearly understand that freight pays the bill. Passenger service is the dessert. We all want dessert. Okay. The freight portion of our need is going to be a long and difficult road to hoe because we do not have a large industrial base. And now I have to turn with that sentence to that movie about if you build the baseball field, they will come. In our case, we will need to improve the rail system before manufacturers will come here. Nobody relocates on a promise. Forgive me. Nobody will relocate here on the promise of a state or a municipality that you come here and we'll have this ready for you. Okay, those stories get packaged up with bridges to be sold. The state needs to come to recognition that we will have petroleum shortages in this country before our children are dead. Never mind what you hear in the political races. We have a serious problem with petroleum supply. New resources are being developed, but we will outgrow them before our children are dead. On the passenger side, where I have my heart, I am a former municipal official in Massachusetts and a former official in Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. When I lived in Massachusetts, a commuter train ran through our town, and we had parking space. You had to be there at 4:30 in the morning to get a space. We expanded the space, and voila, okay, it filled up. We expanded it again, and it filled up. Okay? So I think with that anecdotal story, we can probably replicate the idea that there is a demand and people will use it, and the more you make it available, the more it will get used. So I will then say, okay, given that we need to develop not so much the railroad, but the railroad that is going to attract industry. And we will need to think about, okay, how do we get cars and single passenger cars off the road within a couple of decades?
Thank you, Kit. My name is Chris Williams. I serve as the president of the Chamber of Commerce here in the Greater Nashua region. And I'm going to focus my comments largely just on the passenger side because I do understand the freight side of it. It's actually a very big benefit to many of my member companies here in southern New Hampshire. So I do realize and fully support the recommendations that you have for freight rail, and I hope those go forward. With that, though, on the passenger side, this is the single largest potential economic opportunity for Nashua. There is no other project out there that can have more positive impact on our city and on our region than bringing passenger rail up into our area from Lowell. And I need you guys to take that message back to Concord with you. They hear it from us all the time. In fact, they're getting a little sick and tired of hearing it from us here in Nashua. I've been in many conversations and meetings and hearings with our state legislators up there, some of whom are in the room here tonight. They know our story well, and we need you to be up there advocating for this. You mentioned the Capital Corridor study that needs to be done, and there is a final vote that needs to be taken this Wednesday here in just a couple of days in order to release the state funds that will allow that federal study to go forward. I need you guys to go back to Concord and remind those 5 executive counselors that the private sector raised the money that even allowed those studies to be available in the first place. The Rail Authority, when it was created, the chairman of that authority at the time is in the room here tonight, and that state-created agency came to us and said to the private sector, will you raise the money that we need to go out and apply for these federal grants and win those grants? And we said yes. We did so on good faith that our own state was then going to follow through on its commitment. Come Wednesday, there's a big question and a big vote that needs to be taken, and the state needs to follow through on its good faith. Right now, as I understand it, out of those 5 counselors, we have 2 that are with us. We have 2 that are against us. We have one left. Executive Councilor St. Hilaire up in the Concord area, I believe right now is leaning against us based on my own conversations I've had with him. So for those of us in the room here tonight who have a few minutes to call or send an email to Councilor Dan St. Hilaire tomorrow, I bet he'd love to hear from us. But I need to make sure our own Department of Transportation is actually taking this report and making sure he sees it tomorrow or Wednesday morning before that vote is taken. If he hasn't already seen it, I hope Commissioner Clements is making time tomorrow to make sure he sees this, because he needs to know that our own Department of Transportation feels that Capital Corridor study needs to go forward. Thank you.
Chris, if I may, I'd just like to say thank you. My name is Pete Burling. I'm from Cornish. I got a railroad already. I got 12 miles up on the Connecticut River. What we're trying to do, and the members of the Rail Authority, would you all stand up, the people who've been working for 4 years to try to make this happen? To help us out, if you're in this room and you would like passenger rail service to Nashua and beyond, would you just put up a hand? DOT, are you looking? No, but I am. Sure. Well, that's where I'm going right now. The vote on Wednesday is critical. And as we enter into a summer in which 450 may be the norm, why is it anybody in their right mind would want to shut off the study that can lead us to this passenger service we need? And oh, by the way, my colleague friend Kathy Hirsch said, you don't need a subsidy to get a train into Nashua. You can do that. This is important. But your citizens, we need you to speak out. And Dave, I'm going to hand this to you because you're the guy who passed the bill that started all this.
I really didn't intend to. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. There's certain things that we really want. This is one of them. And I really hope that everybody takes a moment to call or write your executive counselor, not just Dan St. Hilaire, even though I endorse everything Chris said, but call or write them all, because I think they're looking for a way out of this. And I really appreciate your doing that. And it's got to be tomorrow or tonight. It can't be Thursday. Right. Okay? So if you would, it allows you to go the next step forward. Thank you all. And thanks for coming out.
Is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to?
Yeah, excuse me. Sam Langley from Bosquen. I will back up Peter Burling's comments and your Chamber of Commerce gentleman with one addition. No, don't only call Mr. St. Hilaire. Keep in mind we have an election this fall. Come fall, speak to all of the people that are running for office on this subject so that the legislature will get the message very loud and clear that they need to support it as well. Thank you.
My name is James Vela. I work for a real estate development company called Renaissance Downtowns, but I'm also a native of the area. And one of the things that we're trying to do is work in conjunction with the city for the redevelopment of 26 acres along the confluence of the Nashua and Merrimack River. But it also happens to be in walking distance of where a downtown station would be, say Union Station used to be. And the reason we're really excited about this location is because of the tremendous economic opportunity that comes from transportation-oriented development solutions to our problems. And people hit on it many times. We build rail stations, and then the parking fills out, and it reaches capacity. Growth on the rail line stops. Well, if you build the rail line station in the middle of your neighborhood, and the neighborhood grows around that station, the growth never stops. People can walk to the station. They can walk home. Then, you know what? Grocery stores come, and tourism comes, and economic growth comes. And like Chris Williams said, it's the single biggest economic opportunity the city has. And it also sits in what is some of the most downtrodden and least productive land in our city. So let's take the worst part in our city and turn it into the most economically viable part of our city. And I'm really excited for this opportunity for our city.
I grew up in Nashville when we did have these things. We actually did have commuter rail. We had a downtown train station. And it was a wonderful thing. It was a vibrant part of the city, and I remember it very well. And I don't know what the financial model was for that. I know it fell victim, like many other stations, to the fact that people were commuting by car. The improvement of 93 made it less viable. But I think at one time it was viable, and I was wondering how they made it viable.
You're saying the executive council's abandoning this idea. You have a fear that that's what's going to happen. Can you elaborate at all on why that is? Is it all financial? Is it political? What is the reason?
Later. Rail has been a struggle for this state for some years, and I hate to talk about the underside of our politics, but the fact of the matter is there are economic interests that don't want passenger rail. There are people who put asphalt on our highways. Some of them don't like the idea of reduced dependence on Route 93. There are people who want to see us spend $400 to $500 million finishing the widening of 93. There are other folks who run bus companies and see rail, passenger rail, as competition that they don't want. I do not ascribe negative to any of that. It is simply a fact. There are economic interests and political interests that do not applaud the effort that we're about. But the fact remains, it's a political struggle, and those who have a voice in favor of rail, now's the time to exercise it. And I want to say to DOT, I think the plan that you laid out is superbly conservative in making the case. Everything we've done for 4 years, every argument that we've gone over is up on the screen that we saw tonight. And I just submit to all of you, if you really passionately want this, take those arguments, make the telephone calls, and then make the case. Write the letters. That's what'll get it done.
I'd like to also reply to that question, if I might. I'm not trying to speak for any of the executive counselors, but I have talked to one in particular that used to be for this proposition until the last figure came out. Some gentleman back there asked me about the relationship with the railroad. Yes, there was a deal made between the MBTA and Guilford, or Pan Am now, to take the train up to Concord only if they could be the operator. And if they could rebuild the tracks, and their bill for this is somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million, which is way, way exorbitant. I used to work for Amtrak, and I used to work for the MBTA, so I know where I'm coming from on this. It doesn't cost anything like that amount. Even if you bought the $3 million for a passenger car and $4 million for a locomotive, there's no way it could cost $300 million. The one executive counselor, who I think is now negative, used to be for it until that figure came up, and he then voted against it. And he became the third person to kill the project the last time it came up. And he told me flat out, Steve, as long as they're coming up with those kind of figures, and that's what's going to happen if we deal with, you just can't negate the fact that this Fink that you're talking about, the Pan Am Railway is not a stockholder company. It's a privately owned company, and he hates passenger trains. I got real news for you. The reason he agreed to the Portland train is because we rebuilt his entire main line, which is down to 15 mile an hour for freight trains, and now he can run his freight train 60 miles an hour. So he saves on crew costs. That's the only reason he agreed to it. He won't. Amtrak actually had to take his railroad away from him on the Connecticut River line, which is the Vermont route. They had to actually take it away from him and give it to another railroad because he refused to let Amtrak upgrade the tracks beyond 15 miles an hour. And so the government just took it away from him. And this is the way he is. He is not going to cooperate. But as long as, if we're going to deal with Fink and his $300 million, the federal government is never going to agree to pay that for the 60 miles of track that we're talking about in a few passenger cars. Just not going to happen. So you can't blame the executive counselors, but I support, knock yourself out. I'm going to call Dave Wheeler and say, hey, let's put it back up again. But we've got to take the situation away from Guilford. That's all there is to it.
Betty Lasky, and I've been an advocate for rail since my planning board days. At any rate, it's still short-sighted. I don't disagree with what you're saying, don't disagree what may be the cost down the road, but it is still very short-sighted for the Executive Council not to vote and for us not to continue to advocate for this, particularly the study, and put things in place. Things change. Costs change. Certainly the Executive Council changes. And so regardless of and I think he's wrong. You can dispute the figures. I don't disagree with you about Guilford. I've had enough dealings with them, and so I completely understand. But people die, and things change. So, and I'm probably going to be long dead before this comes. I've always said that. But at any rate, I urge each and every one of you to do what Chris Williams said, to do what Peter Burling said, do what I'm going to do tomorrow, is get on your computer, get on your phone, be an annoyance, be whatever you can be, but get to those executive councils.
We're kind of running out of time, folks, so just those who haven't spoken, I'd like to give a chance.
My name is Julie Chen. I'm the transportation planner engineer for the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission in Manchester. The Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission is an active The Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission is an active participant in the Technical Advisory Committee overseeing the update of the plan. The Commission fully supports the work being done by the state and the consultants. The plan provides an efficient and well-maintained railroad system capable of accommodating increasing freight traffic and increasing demand for the passenger rail service in New Hampshire. It is the Commission's hope that the completion of the updated state rail plan will contribute to the development of an efficient and well-maintained rail system. Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission would also like to emphasize the importance of continuing the development of rail in the state as an important element in promoting a truly multimodal transportation system. We strongly feel that the development of such a multimodal system is key to providing not only for our region, but the entire state with the tools required to enable it to compete economically on a national and international level. Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission also wishes to re-emphasize its continuing commitment to the development of passenger rail services in our region. Through our participation in the New Hampshire Rail Transit Authority, we will continue to work towards undertaking the planning and environmental studies required to complete the project. We will continue in our effort along with New Hampshire Department of Transportation, Manchester, Boston Regional Airport, and the Nashua Regional Planning Commission and other stakeholders to continue to work towards the development of strategies to fully fund the passenger rail services in this part of the state. Thank you very much.
I just want to mention that through our website, you will have an opportunity. You can submit comments there that will be included in the plan as we go forward. So if you want to submit anything after tonight, you're more than welcome to do that through the DOT website. But if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak, I'd like to give them a chance. Yeah, if anyone didn't hear Kathy, the presentation that you saw is also on our website, the DOT website, and you can view it there as well.
Good evening. I'm Bill Mosier, and I served 2 terms in the Transportation Committee in the legislature with my colleagues over here. And I have been an advocate also for the rehabilitation of the railroads through the New Hampshire Railroad Revitalization Association. And we have addressed a number of things. One of the things that has not been addressed so far is that in the early 1980s, President Clinton had designated the high-speed route between Boston and Montreal to come up through Nashua and over the old Northern Line to go up to Montreal. That was approved in Vermont, and money was put to that for the study of the line to see that it was viable. Massachusetts also had looked at the line to see if it was viable, and it was. And New Hampshire, at the time, was having its own problems with utilizing the money that was made available for this study to check the revitalization of the line. Instead, we have let that sit on a back burner. That, I think, is one of the lines that Kit has mentioned as it's sitting on the side. It can be revitalized, but at the present time is not really viable. I was chairman of the task force for commuter rail on the seacoast, and we had discussions with MBTA and Amtrak. Amtrak made a very important point that wherever there's a rail station, that the return on investment at that time in, I think it was around 1983, was about $16 or $18 for every dollar that was invested. There's a number of things that we don't always look at when we are thinking about passenger rail. We could look easily at the Milford-Bennington line as being a light rail line with a stop through all of the various shopping areas along Route 101A. Also with a stop in Nashua Airport, which I had discussed with the former mayor, and they thought that that was a wonderful idea as well. The Milford-Bennington line would be a good feeder into Nashua for the heavy rail going into the Boston area. We had looked at that as a possible viable option for increasing the commuter rail. Without electrification, there are a number of options that are available there with self-powered vehicles, light rail, diesel-powered, that are very economical to operate and can be adjusted according to what the capacity is required. There's a number of things that can be done along that way. The fact that you have the amount of money that could be realized by the building of a station, and it tends to also, what do you call it when the sprawl, urban sprawl, that it tends also to decrease urban sprawl when you have a station and location. And this can be recognized when you look at the line as it goes out through Exeter. Exeter is a very important station on Amtrak. I've had the opportunity to ride Amtrak myself several times, and you know, the idea of being able to sit in a air-conditioned or well-heated rail car, sipping my coffee and doing some work on the way down. You look at the passenger rail and you think about all of the time that's spent by all of these people riding in all of these automobiles and the lost production time, what it costs the economy when you have all of these people that have lost an hour or 2 hours of productive time in trying to get something done. This has been mentioned. And also, another little thing that is maybe not that significant is the idea of the kiss and ride. Now, you may ask, what is that kiss and ride? Well, where the wife drives the husband to the station, and she drops him off there, and then she has the use of the automobile for the rest of the day to not only tend to the, you know, being a soccer mom or whatever it may be, but to do her shopping and whatever else that she has to do, you know, maybe a little beauty parlor treatment. You never can tell. Most of the women in Nashville are all very attractive anyway, so. Yes. But think of the saving that you get in wear and tear on the automobile, the reduction in the use of fuel, how much less it will cost you, and the reduction in the insurance cost to operate that vehicle. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about when you start talking about commuter rail. When I chaired the Seacoast, we had one gentleman there in Portsmouth who said that he would gladly pay an extra $1 on his property tax so that he could ride the train. And at the same time, I had Mr. Fink, who said that if we wanted to rebuild that Eastern Line, we were welcome to run our trains on it.
Thank you. Tim Moore, I'm on the Rail Authority. I think it's important when we all contact our executive counselors the next day or so to remind them that they're approving a contract to do the studies. It in no way commits New Hampshire to spend any money to actually do the implementation. But it's only to do these studies so we have the data, the cost benefits, the revenues, the economic development, so we can make an important decision based on real data and not just speculation that, oh, rail costs too much. So that would be my point there.
Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak?
Well, I was thinking I would just sort of wrap it up by saying I've been to these meetings for the last 30 years, and this is the best turnout, the most interested people, the most active people, and we all have our jobs to do now from here on. Thank you to all of you who've come out tonight. It's a great showing. I hope you have the number count to tell people.
I'm not sure if this is appropriate. You will tell me. I'm your neighbor, one of the neighbors from the south. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm Corey Lambert. I live in Tingsboro. And I think the choir has been preaching to the choir tonight. I haven't heard a lot of naysayers here. I've been around the country, ex-military. I think rail was a transportation system of the far past. And I think a lot of people thought we were going to get away from it. I think rail is the way of the future. We've seen the numbers. And I think that some very, very, very powerful people, not only in New Hampshire, but in Massachusetts, oppose what we've been talking about tonight. So it's not just New Hampshire people that have to be convinced. And how you convince the folks in Massachusetts, don't know. I live there. I think rail is I think growth in the high-density part of New Hampshire is being stunted by your lack of rail. I think the high-density population of the Capital Corridor has enough people so that the legislature can get its arms around the rail system and make this happen for you. Not just you, but all the rest of the folks that live with you. And so I would make it absolutely a campaign issue on every future campaign in the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we talked about one last comment. Chris wants to close, and then one thing I want to point out is we'll be here for a bit. If you want to talk about maps or anything we talked about one-on-one, we'll be happy to do that. So Chris, why don't you finish?
Thank you. Just one final comment. I had several people ask me what are the phone numbers that you could actually use tomorrow. If you have 2 phone calls to make, the first one you want to call is David Wheeler. He's our home counselor. You're probably not going to change his mind, but you can annoy him. His number is 672-6062. Again, that's David Wheeler, 672-6062. He's voting against it right now. The one that's on the fence, the one that we hope to have a shot with, is Dan St. Hilaire, Hilaire. His home office number is 856-7617. 856-7617. Those are the 2 best calls you can make tomorrow.
Could you make sure if you didn't sign in when you came in to do so on your way out, please? And I'd like to thank everybody for coming and staying and listening and for all your great comments.